This is the Performance People podcast brought to you by our new brand, Ainsley and Ainsley, giving you the sleep, rest and recovery you need when you need it most with our new night powder supplement. Just shake and take 1 to 2 hours before bed, sleep like an athlete and wake up different. Now on the pod this week, a man at the heart of the data revolution in professional sport, whose approach helped Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool to win the Premier League and the Champions League. Ian Graham shares the stories and insights that got them there, how his data model brought Mo Salah to the club, how he influenced Liverpool's incredible 4-0 comeback win over Barcelona, and why even Jurgen Klopp's appointment as manager came through this very approach. He also explains why data's full potential in sport hasn't yet been reached, and even how it can play a part in our own everyday performance. Listen or watch on your usual platform. So if I ask you the question of was it the data what won it for Liverpool where the Champions League is concerned, what's your answer?
Is still needed. It's another lie about Moneyball, is that it replaces, expertise. It doesn't replace expertise, it adds to it.
And what about someone like Jurgen Klopp? Didn't your data to some degree find him?
His last season at Dortmund was an unmitigated disaster. And the question I was asked was, is this something to worry about? And when we tried to instigate this new plan of we're going to be technology driven and data driven, we're going to do things in a new way, the answer quite often was, well, this is Liverpool and we do things the Liverpool way. And it was very difficult for people to hear that, well, the Liverpool way hasn't worked for 20 years. We might as well try something different.
Ian, before we answer the question, well, you're going to answer the question of whether data led to the Champions League victory for Liverpool and the Premier League victory for Liverpool. Before we do that, let's just anchor this conversation in your moment in time, because that'll lead us to discuss everything that we want to discuss around the subject of data and why it's so important and how it can win you the Premier League. But can we just start with what your moment in time is?
Yeah, sure. My moment in time was back in April 2018, the second leg of the Champions League semi-final against Barcelona. I was Liverpool's head of research, doing all the data side of things for Liverpool since 2012, and we'd won nothing. And we went into that second leg of the semi-final 6 years into my tenure there, 3-0 down from the first leg. So we needed to win by 4 clear goals, because the away goals rule was still in effect back then, or win 3-0 and take it to penalties. And as someone who deals in probability, part of his profession, I'd calculated the probability of us actually qualifying for the final to be about 3.5%. So I was in two minds whether to even go to the game or not, but luckily I made the right decision to go to the game. And the beautiful thing about sport is unexpected things sometimes happen. We dominated the game and won 4-0 to make it to the final, where we beat Spurs, and it's Liverpool's first trophy since I'd joined the club 6 years previously.
So let's just unpack that a bit. So you almost didn't go to the game that ended up being one of the key games in the last sort of, however many years of Liverpool's history. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary what happened. Just tell us the story behind that, because I've read your book, but for others who haven't, it's a great story, and it's basically a never give up piece, which effectively in the end you didn't, but you almost did.
Mo Salah is our sort of best player. And one of the great things about Mo is he's never injured, but he was injured for that game against Barcelona. But he watched it from the stands wearing a T-shirt that said "Never give up." I think from my point of view, we were underdogs in 2013-14 and came within a couple of games of winning the title. I was there on the last day of the season when we still had a mathematical chance of winning, and then we lost. I was at the UEFA Cup final, or Europa League final, I should say, in 2016, which we lost. Against the odds, we made it to the Champions League final in Kyiv in 2018, which we lost. I was kind of just sick of going to finals and losing. This was just a semi-final, and it was 3.5%. And really, it was my friend Jin said, "Are you going to the game? We've got to see Messi play." And I'd never watched Messi play live before, so realised Jin was right. So he persuaded me that it was the right thing to go to the game. And Messi played really well, like he always does, but luckily not well enough to score a goal.
I love the fact that you went to the Liverpool game, being the Liverpool data guy, having sort of seen them not win before and trying desperately for this all to happen behind the scenes just to watch Messi play.
Yeah, I'd kind of resigned myself to the fact that there was no way we were going to qualify for the final.
So if I ask you the question of was it the data what won it for Liverpool where the Champions League is concerned, um, what's your answer?
Um, I'd say that data helped. I think it was an important part of what we did at Liverpool. Um, the most important thing it did was to help inform recruitment and transfer policy. The most important thing in football is the players. If you've got the best players, 9 out of 10 times you'll win the game. That's a quote from Johan Cruyff. I don't know if he did the statistics on that, but it's a great soundbite. And so our concept was, um, like in Moneyball, uh, which comes originally from baseball. Our concept was to try and
And
find
that's the
the
story
players
of
who
the
give you the
Oakland Days, right? That's the story of the Oakland Days that
yeah.
got made into a film with Brad Pitt and everything else. Billy Bean.
Yeah, exactly. So the Oakland A's had a small budget. They they kept if they went after the same players as everyone else, or the same type of players as everyone else, they just wouldn't sign as good players, and they would continue being a bad team. So they decided to pay less attention to what people traditionally pay attention to in baseball, which is how good do you look as an athlete, and they paid more attention to how effective are you at getting runs or at getting batters out. And quite often, the players who were good at that didn't particularly look like great athletes. So, because Liverpool's owners came from the Boston Red Sox, they'd applied Moneyball principles to a big budget team. The A's were a small budget team, Red Sox a big budget team. But again, the Red Sox had won nothing for a century, started doing things a bit more intelligently and won the World Series. Our owners kind of demanded we do the same in football. Now, football's a lot harder to analyze when it comes to data than baseball is. If a if a
Why? Just explain
pitcher
why that is.
if a pitcher gets a batter out, that's got a direct, easily measurable effect on the game. If a batter makes a run or gets on base, you can calculate the change in probability of winning this game given the batter's got on base, and no one can really argue with those probabilities. They're as close as it comes to facts in sports data. In football, if you've taken a shot on goal, or if you've done a pass, or even if you've done a tackle, it's really unclear how that's affected your team's chance of winning. If you've taken a shot from outside the box, maybe that's decreased your team's chance of winning because you should have done something else instead. It's very difficult to measure what you might have done instead. It's very difficult to measure the impact of any particular action. And so, yeah, until the 20th century, it was impossible because the data just didn't exist. In baseball, cricket's very similar. The data so well describes the games, things like batting averages, bowling averages. They tell you they're not perfect, but they tell you a lot about how good a player is. Whereas in football, pass completion percentage tells you nothing, and we didn't even get data on passes till the 21st century. So we were starting off from way behind where baseball started off, and because the game's so complex and so interactive. Everything you do depends on 10 teammates and 11 opponents. And it's just an order of magnitude more difficult to analyze than a sort of a series of one-on-one interactions, which is what baseball and what cricket are to a first approximation.
So, how can you affect the most change as a data analyst? Where do you start? And presumably once you start, there's no end of places that you can go to with it. But also, it must be in the interpretation of that data, because as we well know, data can present all sorts of different storylines depending on which you're looking for. So how can you affect the most change? If I'm Jurgen Klopp and I come to you and I say, right, this is what I need to know about this player, where do you start and what do you give someone like that?
Yeah, well, it's a big advantage of my turning up at Liverpool compared to another club. When I speak to colleagues who work for different clubs, the usual sort of trajectory a data person at a club takes is they turn up, no one knows what to do with them, and then they make some contribution somewhere, and then everyone thinks, wow, I can use this data person to help. The data person gets swamped in 100 different requests from the fitness department, from the set piece coach, from the recruitment department, and so on. I had the luxury of our owners having a very clear vision for the club, and part of that clear vision was transfers and recruitment is where we're wasting all of our money. Um, if we want to be more efficient, we should concentrate our efforts on where we're wasting the most money. And Moneyball is a terrible word, but it's the word that describes sort of using data and using new approaches in sport. And part of that word is money. If you look at the Premier League, 65% of clubs' revenues are spent on player wages, and about 25% are spent on transfer fees. So for every pound a club makes from TV rights and fans attending games and selling shirts and so on, 90 pence of that is spent on the players. Some of it's spent on the manager and the other staff as well, but about 90 pence is spent on the players. If you go to the Championship, most Championship clubs spend more than 100% of revenue on player wages. So, the owners are paying more than the club makes just to pay the players' wages. So that kind of tells you what football already thinks is important. All of the money goes on players. So the concept was to try and maximize the amount of performance we get per pound spent on the players. And that's not to say we were going to be cheap, but we have a certain amount of money we spend. We want to make that sure that money's on the pitch and performing well, which clubs do really badly in general. And Liverpool in particular had done really, really badly for the last sort of the previous sort of 20 years. Your second question was about interpretation, and yeah, interpretation is really the key to data analysis. Data people have a habit of falling in love with the analysis they do, just like an old school scout will fall in love with a player that he watches, and it's tempting to think this analysis you've done is the truth in some way. So you've always got to worry about context. So at Liverpool, we've paid a lot of attention to not just the quality of the analysis. I think the quality of the analysis was good, but the best way of interpreting that. So there are many examples of great players that just don't fit into your team, or conversely, a player who might not look that great at first glance, but he answers all of the needs that your team have got. And so that interpretation of the data is absolutely vital element.
But that's a
At
really
Liverpool, we
tricky
had
one to convince. If you're having a conversation with a manager about that and you're trying to make the case for or against a particular player that they're either really keen to bring in or they want to offload, how do you sort of make that argument? Because in your preconception, if you really, like you've said about the fact that the scout falls in love with the player that they've been watching, that they're completely invested in, and they really want to champion their case, how do you convince otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I fall in love with players just from a data perspective. Even before I've watched the player once, a player will pop up looking brilliant at X, Y, and Z. I think I already love this guy. You do need to see them play, but even without seeing him play, I'm really keen on this player. So I can be as passionate about players I like and dislike as any old school scout can. When it comes to convincing a manager, again, it's a luxury I had at Liverpool. I didn't have to convince the manager. Um, we had a sporting director, Michael Edwards, in place, whose job was really to help make those final decisions on players. Jurgen Klopp was very open to experts coming in with different points of view, which was great, and open to the idea of data analysis. But he wasn't the sort of coach that you could present a spreadsheet with 10 columns of data to and sort of show, well, this player's 93rd percentile on column G. That means we should sign him. That's not the way to get Jurgen excited about a player. And so our data view of a player got translated into video and into a narrative about a player that would look on the surface a lot like a traditional way of presenting a player to a manager. It's just that process of showing players to managers or recommending players to managers, that's got some science behind it, as well as the old school scouting as well. That side is still needed. It's another lie about Moneyball, is that it replaces, expertise. It doesn't replace expertise, it adds to it.
I was gonna ask you that as well, because nowadays, of course, we have this challenge of humans versus ChatGPT or whatever it might be that's available in an AI form. And I was going to ask you about the balance of how you mesh together the humans and the just the gut instinct bit with the science.
Yeah, they've both got their own strengths. There's a great book from 2012, I think it was, The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver, who used to do baseball statistics. He does election statistics as well. And he built one of the first systems for trying to kind of predict the trajectory of a player's career. And the model worked quite well. And then he revisited the model a few years later and asked the question, does it outperform the scout? And the answer was no, it doesn't outperform the scout, which was a surprise because, the whole promise of Moneyball is we can do better than how things used to be. And he found out the reason was the scouts had started using the data. And that really is the trick. So in football, it's the same as baseball. You've got thousands and thousands of potential players to choose from. With my new business, I consult with a number of clubs, and the usual format they work in is everyone's kind of rushing to know about hundreds of different players. What data does is to just say, these hundreds of players you can sign, these 10 we think are really, really good. Look at these guys first, because you just haven't got the bandwidth to look at 100 players in a great amount of detail. You use the data to help get there quicker. And again, I think like with ChatGPT, no matter what you're using it for, I use it to help me. I'm not a great programmer. So I use it to help me write code better. It doesn't come up with the idea for me. It doesn't write the code for me, but it will solve in 5 minutes a problem that I'd sort of be bashing my head against the keyboard for 2 hours if I didn't have access to that AI. So I think the two things do work together. To say it's a war of old school versus new school is always a bit of a caricature, I think.
And I guess the other thing is that, you need buy-in from people. I mean, you talk about Jurgen Klopp being really receptive. John W. Henry also, really understood the American system and the baseball system, and therefore was receptive to the idea of data analytics with Liverpool. How much is it of that as well that you need to have a conversation with people that are all in? Because I feel like with this, in order to prove what you want to prove to people, they need to be willing to sort of take on board what you're saying. Have you come up against circumstances, well, I know you have previously with other managers, where they're not receptive to that? They don't want to know. It's really hard. And how do you break through that?
Yeah, it's a prerequisite that you've got to be open to doing things differently. So previously to Jurgen Klopp, the manager at Liverpool was Brendan Rodgers, and he was very clear, to be fair to him, that he wanted to run Liverpool in the old-fashioned English way, which is the manager decides everything, including all aspects of recruitment. And there was no argument about it. It was his view; things had to be that way, and it caused a clash because the owners wanted to do things in a new way. And unfortunately, the only solution to that was Brendan leaving the club. The owners felt we couldn't sort of move the club forward without more collaboration between if you bring a player to the club, the manager has to want that player and has to be excited about that player. He still has to be on board and the most important part of that sign-in process. But they also have to be open. So we solved the problem by changing the people. We went from a closed-minded manager to an open-minded manager. And I think as data becomes more mainstream and as a new generation of coaches start to coach in the Premier League, I think that problem solves itself to a large degree. So coaches from 20 years ago, when I started in football, they had zero exposure to data because there was no data about players in football. The only things that had been done in the past were by Charles Reap and Charles Hughes at the FA, who were responsible for like the long ball game of the England national team in the 70s. The data was kind of painted with this negative, well, we tried that in the 70s and it didn't work. 20 years later, you've got managers who are ex-players that grew up with physical performance data at least, and maybe some tactical performance data at least, and also young managers wanting to make the next move in their career. If you want to become Brighton manager or Brentford manager or Liverpool manager, they know these days you have to be across, what is data analysis in football. I at least need an understanding of it if I want to be able to work effectively at these clubs. So, I never really solved that problem and never really changed anyone's minds. I just sort of waited until the problem's solved for me.
And what about with someone like Jurgen Klopp? Didn't your data to some degree find him?
So the shortlist we had for managers in 2015 when we made that change, it was a small shortlist, and Jurgen was a pretty obvious choice. He'd taken a massive German club, historically successful, but had sort of suffered some thin times, taken them back to success. That was Liverpool was waiting for that story to happen to them as well. And he'd done it at a budget much lower than Bayern Munich's as well. But his last season at Dortmund was an unmitigated disaster. And the question I was asked was, is this something to worry about? If we hire this manager, will there become a point where the team's performance drops off a cliff for whatever reason? And I used some very simple, by today's standards, some very simple data analysis using expected goals. Expected goals just tells you how good a particular shot in the game was. Short range chances are more likely to be converted than long range chances. Penalties are more likely to be converted than open play shots. So I used that data to say, even though Dortmund were in the relegation zone at Christmas, even though they finished only 7th, they were still clearly the second best team in Germany. I think they had the second best expected goal difference, the second best expected points. Had those chances been converted like they would have been in a typical season? And so my answer to Liverpool's owners was, you know what, Dortmund were more or less as good as they'd been in the previous season. They just got a huge dose of bad luck, the second highest dose of bad luck in a decade of Bundesliga seasons. And so that answered their first question, which was, is there anything to worry about with this guy? We also did a lot of analysis of Dortmund's squad. Liverpool at the time had the youngest, or certainly one of the youngest squads in the Premier League. And we believed that some of those players would go on to be very good players, but they needed a good coach to, first of all, trust in and play the younger players and help them achieve their potential. And Jurgen's other great achievement at Dortmund was he won Bundesliga with the youngest team in the league, an average age of 22.7, I think it was. The goalkeeper at age 29 was the only regular starter who was over 25. And then I think next season, I might be mistaken with this, but I think next season they got even younger and won it again. And so it's like, here's a coach who will play young players, and he gets a tune out of these young players as well. Another manager we looked at was Carlo Ancelotti. And Ancelotti is another very good manager. If you look at his career, he typically had one of the older squads, and it was a squad packed full of superstars. He's a great manager with great experience, but his experience was take this team of superstars and win something. If you're a Real Madrid manager or AC Milan manager, winning the league or winning the Champions League this season with these stars that we've given you, that's what your job is. That's not what the Liverpool job was at the time. It was much more like the job Jurgen had done at Dortmund and at Mainz.
God, isn't that fascinating? So you, with your data and the information you had at your fingertips, effectively determined the course of action that the Liverpool owners took and the journey that they went on. And ultimately, you could say that you actually gave them the success that they were after by pressing them to hire the right guy.
I mean, I'm happy to take the credit. I should say that John Henry was obsessed with Dortmund way of playing back in 2012. So I think one of my first conversations with him, he was raving about this Dortmund team that I also loved at the time. I didn't watch German football at the time, but all of these Dortmund 21-year-olds started popping up at the top of my list of player rankings. So yeah, let's give the FSG a little bit of credit as well for that.
Yeah, you're being way too humble. But what about in terms of the players as well? Because there must have been moments where you're like arguing the case for a particular player, knowing that the data you have supports that. I mean, are there moments that you can recall during your time at Liverpool? I'm sure there are, where one person was being talked about or being discussed, and actually the data was convincing enough that it made the decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think there was a definite step change when Jurgen arrived. Um, Before that, it was very much a case of Brendan really put a premium on Premier League players. He knew those players a lot better. You know, Premier League players are among the best players in the world. And the problem for us was they tend to attract really high wages and transfer fees because of that Premier League experience. And that there was a kind of clash with our philosophy, which was to try and get more performance for less money. So we would argue about, getting a player from abroad instead of this experienced Premier League player, and these arguments would just go back and forth, and we'd end up not making a decision and having to sign a second or third choice player. And I think it was Jurgen's first transfer window, so it would have been the January 2016. On January 2016, yeah, January 2016. We didn't actually sign the players until the summer, but two players he mentioned were Joel Matip, who was signed on a free transfer from Schalke, and scouts tended to dislike Matip because he quite often made quite silly errors in games, whereas from the data's point of view, what he added, it was worth paying for those errors because they were high profile and eye catching, but it's, one every 10 or 15 games, and he's saving you so many goals in the meantime in the games he doesn't make those errors. And I think when Jurgen suggested that we sign him, I was like really pleased that here's a player who looks good in the data, but because of those high profile errors, a lot of managers would be a little bit cautious about, I might look stupid if I sign this player and then he slips over in his first game. Jurgen didn't show that caution. So I was like rubbing my hands together thinking, here's a manager who's happy to sign a player who's not, he doesn't have to look like the most elegant or the most accomplished player, but he's an effective player. And similarly with Sadio Mane, we signed from Southampton. We had an opportunity to sign him from Salzburg, much cheaper 2 or 3 years previously. But again, there was some caution and a little bit of risk aversion in signing this unknown player. And again, it was Jurgen's impetus that said, let's sign Mane. So he was a manager who's kind of somehow instinctively liking the same players that the data liked.
And wasn't Mo Salah one of them as well on the data front?
Yeah. So Mo always looked outstanding in the data. When he was at Basel in Switzerland, we only had UEFA data for him. We didn't get data on the Swiss league at the time. But as like a 20 and a 21-year-old, he looked like one of the best wingers in UEFA competition. I think he played really well against Spurs and against Chelsea. So I think English teams would have been aware. And we thought we were going to sign him in January 2014 when we nearly won the league. And then Chelsea gazumped us. You'd have to ask someone at Chelsea. I don't think they were particularly interested in the player. They just signed him so that we wouldn't have him. And then he proceeded to not play for Chelsea for the next 2.5 seasons. And that was held against him in Premier League circles. It was held against him that he'd failed at Chelsea. He'd been brilliant in Italy. And for us, it was an obvious signing. He's the best attainable wide forward in the world. I think he was 24 when we signed him. And it wasn't even close. And I think Mo is a bit of a boring signing because everyone agreed. So the scouts loved him. My boss, Michael Edwards, loved him. The data loved him. Jurgen preferred Julian Brandt initially, but, he changed his mind and said, okay, Mo is the player to go for. So he was an easy one. The surprise with Mo was that there wasn't a bidding war with Arsenal or a bidding war with Manchester United. I think it was because he'd been tarred with this failure of, he can't do it in the Premier League. It doesn't take much to go back to 2014 and see that Eden Hazard was starting in Mo's position every game for Chelsea. And you can ask yourself the question, is it really that there's some problem with the player's mentality that meant he didn't get on the pitch? Or is it just that as a 21-year-old, he wasn't as good as Eden Hazard at the time? So there was from our point of view, it was completely explainable why he didn't make it at Chelsea. And it wasn't anything negative against Mo. It was just difficult to get into that team. Kevin De Bruyne found it difficult to get into that team. Romelu Lukaku found it difficult to get into that team.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you make because it's not just about the player, it's about the environment and the context that they're going to inhabit when they actually get there, whether they are or aren't the right signing for the club at the right time with the right group of people around them, and whether they're supported in the right way. Is there a player that's got away? Is there anyone that you've been banging the drum for to try and get a club to sign and you're just like, I don't know how many more ways I can say this, and it's just not happened and you've watched them go from here to here?
The nice thing about Liverpool was that they did usually
listened.
try. They did usually try. So even the ones we didn't get, it would have been very difficult or impossible to get. I think I worked for Spurs for a few years before Liverpool, and the one that got away there was Mesut Ozil. It was before the World Cup in 2010. He ended up going to Real Madrid, and I think if Spurs had moved a little bit earlier, there might have been a chance to sign Ozil. At Liverpool, the one that really did get away, he played that wide forward role like Mo plays, but he could also play centre forward, was Diego Costa. And again, it was an argument with the manager at the time because his priorities were very different for that position. We just argued for so long that by the time we did agree to put a bid in, the player already signed a new contract at Atletico Madrid. But as a Liverpool fan, I hated Diego Costa when he played for Chelsea. He's like a Luis Suarez character that you love to hate. But I know that if he'd played for Liverpool, I would have felt very differently about him.
So you've now stepped away from Liverpool, but you're consulting in a broader sense. What's your kind of perception of the way in which the Premier League is travelling at the minute? There's all sorts of things going on and lots of changes happening. Manchester City going through a strange time, Manchester United trying to get back to glory days. Like, what's your sort of perception sitting from the outside now, looking in, not being so intrinsically linked to Liverpool, just the bigger picture of what's happening and where it's headed, and how data can help?
Yeah, I think the Premier League's really pulled away from the rest of Europe in terms of finances. So it used to be the case that, the big European giants would earn more than the big Premier League teams, and the sort of mid-level teams in the big leagues would be earning similar amounts of money. But these days, a mid-tier or a small Premier League team would be one of the biggest earners across Europe, and that means the best players in the world, or the Premier League can afford to pay the best players in the world to a much greater degree than it could before. I think in terms of its standing in the world, it becomes stronger, and that's really interesting. It's also really interesting that the revenue distribution model means that there's not quite as much disparity between the very top end and the bottom end. So there's always some competitiveness. Manchester City, unfortunately, my time at Liverpool coincided with the best Premier League team of all time for 5 or 6 seasons. I wish Manchester City would play like they're playing today, sometime between 2017 and 2022. That would have been nice. But all empires crumble eventually. Liverpool found that in the 80s. Manchester United found that in the 2010s. And so it'd be good to have a little bit more competitiveness at the top level.
Is there something on that, Ian? Is there something in the cycle? Is there something in sort of a club getting to a place where they experience such highs and then invariably it has to come back down the other side? And, how much is that just to do with a cyclical pattern of behavior versus actually, something that's intrinsically wrong?
Yeah, I can't remember who said the quote, but it goes along the lines of achieving success is hard, but maintaining success is even harder. I think that's we found at Liverpool. I think we only won one Premier League title, but the sustained level of performance that we had was top 4 in Premier League history because we were trying to fight against the best team in Premier League history, and it becomes a strain because you have to keep on being perfect, and to keep that level of discipline for that long is just hard. I found it hard, and I was very far away from the coal face, as it were. My stresses were much less than Jurgen or the owners or the players. And yeah, that difficulty of having to keep on being perfect, having to keep on innovating, it's hard to keep the motivation up. And then when the leader of that moves on or loses motivation, I think that's the kind of signal to end. I think you saw that at Manchester United when Ferguson left. It was really Ferguson was the emperor of Manchester United. There was no structure there behind him to keep the success going after he left. I think it's interesting at Liverpool. I certainly tried to leave behind a department that could keep on doing the best data analysis in the Premier League, and my colleagues tried to do the same. And it's early days for Liverpool so far, but I hope we put some foundations in place that last a little bit longer than we did there.
Statistically speaking, how long do you think it's going to be before Manchester United turn things around?
They've got every advantage you can think of in terms of revenue, fan base, history. They've wasted huge amounts of money on inappropriate recruitment, but they've still got among the highest commercial and TV revenues in Europe. It really needs some structural change. It's difficult to say from the outside. I don't know what Manchester United look on the inside. I can speak about Liverpool, which was in a similar position when I arrived there. Liverpool had been the dominant team of the 1980s and hadn't innovated. The club was very much a 20th century club when I arrived. And when we tried to instigate this new plan of we're going to be technology driven and data driven, we're going to do things in a new way, the answer quite often was, well, this is Liverpool and we do things the Liverpool way. And it was very difficult for people to hear that, well, the Liverpool way hasn't worked for 20 years. We might as well try something different because whatever the Liverpool way is, it's not working. It's going to have to change. And I think that structural change has to happen at Manchester United. I don't know, but I can imagine, if my equivalent was going into Manchester United to start a data department, the answer they would get would be, well, we don't do things that way. It's not the Manchester United way. That structural change has to happen. They've got so many intrinsic advantages in terms of revenue. If they were competently run, they could turn things around in a short time frame. As a Liverpool fan, I hope that they don't, but they are able to.
Final question then, because we're running out of time, and I know you've got your computer screen to go back to analyze more numbers. But final question: can you ever just enjoy watching a game of football? I studied history of art A level, and I can't walk past a building or a picture or a painting without taking it apart on some basis. So is there that? Is there a scenario where you can ever just sit and just enjoy it, or are you always analyzing?
Uh, uh, yes, it's quite a clear answer to this one. When I sit in the stand, or even when I watch a game on TV, the analyst disappears. So, my colleagues at Liverpool are much better at analysing players and performances on video than I am. My speciality is data. So, the analyst disappears and the fan appears. Even if it's just a game between two teams that I don't care about, I'll pick one of them, and then I'll immediately think the referee's biased against us, and I'll shout and scream like the most uncouth season ticket holder. I think it's important, why work in sport instead of in insurance, because you love sport. It would be a bit sad if I had to have the spreadsheet open while I was watching the game. I do have the team lists and the ages of players, so that if I think a player's good, I'll see, is he on loan from Brighton? Is he over 25? Might one of my clubs be interested in signing him? And then I'll go and log on to my player ratings platform and see, actually, he's not very good. And that will teach me that I'm not great at watching players on video. I should pay more attention to my data analysis.
So the answer is you start off with the best of intentions, and then it drifts naturally, as it always would do, into a data piece. Brilliant. Ian, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been really brilliant to catch up with you. I love your book. It's so informative, so interesting, and really insightful. Thank you for catching up with me.
Oh, thanks so much. It was great talking to you, Georgie.
Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point I just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.